was an elite professional consulate professional corps. Yet ironically, as our global involvement started to expand rapidly after the war, the Consular Corps and consulates began a long and steady decline, shrinking in numbers steadily, shrinking in prestige, gradually becoming a kind of an orphan within the Department of State. And while I know during your tenure with things like the MRV program, you did some very significant things to attempt to do more with less, or as you said in one of your interviews, to do more with nothing. But I remember one of the first State Department issues when I began in the government back in the Nixon administration was the closing of a whole range of consulates and consolidating them. And then when I was Secretary of the Navy, I was deeply involved in a lot of skirmishing throughout my tenure, because the Navy is particularly dependent on consulates in ports around the world, and they were being closed at an even greater pace during the Reagan years. So my question to you is, while I know, and your testimony and your statement outlines some important and significant tactical efforts that you made to fight what was essentially a rearguard battle against personnel cuts and closings and so forth, could you give us an idea about what you might have done or what should have been done to take a larger view to look at the overall steady decline of which your particular tactical problems were a part, and what was done to try to reverse this and to reinvigorate the Consular Corps as a line of defense against terrorism, and importantly, to get the resources, because next to the Coast Guard and INS, there probably is no other orphan so underfunded historically as the cone that you headed in state. Were your obstacles a lack of recognition of the importance? Were they budget cutting within the Department of State? Was it OMB? Or was it principally the congressional appropriations that kept this inexorable decline going even as the threat increased?
Mr. Secretary, we in the Bureau of Consular Affairs take our responsibility, when I was there, took the responsibility as the outer ring of border security very, very seriously. We were faced with many of the things that you describe. In the mid-90s, the budgets were completely inadequate, and this was before the MRV money, machine-readable visa money, began to really come in. We just got the authorization in FY94. We were charging at that time $20 per machine-readable visa application, but we did not have that technology worldwide. So we didn't have a lot of money. And so we were devastated by the budget cuts. We were devastated by the lack of junior officer intake. I would say that the people that we used in lieu of junior officers who were civil servants on excursion tours, there were specialists in other areas of the department, and we also hired Foreign Service spouses to do this work. They did a fantastic job. But the message that was sent by this to the rest of the Department of State was that consular work was really not that important. And it was the only cone, what we call the specializations cones, the only cone where this occurred. All other cones were staffed completely by Foreign Service officers. So we had that problem. I would tell you, sir, that the high point of my career was in the Bureau of Consular Affairs, serving with the people in my bureau, which is a primarily civil service bureau, and serving with consular officers worldwide, because I really believe they're the finest public servants in the government. They take their responsibilities very, very seriously, As you heard from the staff, in Jeddah, for example, they were interviewing 200 people a day. I interviewed 200 people a day 30 years ago when I was in Monterrey, Mexico. I can tell you how hard that work is and how difficult it is and how worn down you are by the end of the day and how you always have people left over that you were not able to reach, to interview, even though you were working as hard as you can. It's demoralizing work for consular officers. But I would tell you, which I believe with all my heart, that they did it to the best of their ability, that they love this country, that they're patriots, that they chose government service not for the money and not for the prestige, because neither exists in the government anymore. But they chose it because they love this country and they want to serve our country and the American people. And despite the fact that these 19 people exploited our weaknesses, I believe that the consular officers around the world and the consular officers issued to these people did their jobs to the best of their ability with the knowledge and the tools that they had at the time.
But my question really is, where was the problem? Why were you the orphan? Was it a prejudice within the department or an ignorance within the department? Was it over at OMB that all the cutting went on? Was it, or was it in Congress? And did you reclama as, I mean, the disparity between the needs and the mandates you had and the resources you were given is so gross that I would have expected you to be raising hell at each of these three levels. Did you?
I did, sir. We have a program in the Department of State called the Bureau Program Plan, which is the way that we try to match resources and money. We did very good Bureau program plans that didn't, unfortunately, get us the money that we needed. I believe that it was the Congress in the mid-1990s that cut us. If you remember, in the mid-1990s, we had the furlough, because I believe that there were people in the Congress who did not know that the U.S. government did anything that the American people needed or wanted or couldn't get when we were closed.
And was this in foreign relations or in the appropriating process?
It's in the appropriations process.
And did the intelligence committees have a say?
I don't know, sir, because we didn't ever testify before the Intelligence Committee. I certainly didn't. We testified before the Appropriations Committee. I testified before the immigration subcommittees of House and Senate. We tried higher up than I in the chain of command in the State Department, tried to get us the money that we needed, tried to get the department the money that we needed. It simply wasn't there. The Congress had higher priorities, or priorities that they felt were more significant than funding the State Department.
Ms. Meissner, I'd like to ask you a similar question. You said you got the budget up to $4+ billion by the time you left, but your successor has made a very good case with very specifics, just matching minimal funds to the mandates that Congress has provided, and comes up with a figure 10 times that size. As a similar orphan in a larger department, how did you raise hell? And at which levels were your biggest obstacle? Again, was it Congress? Was it OMB in the White House? Or was it within your own cabinet department?
Well, Mr. Secretary, I think our circumstances during the time that I was there were slightly different from a budget standpoint, because we were growing very, very rapidly. The difficulty with INS, of course, was how fast could you grow? I mean, there were years that we were growing 15, 20% a year, and we didn't have the infrastructure to handle the recruiting and the training and the deployment and the space. So the difficulty that we had with funding was not so much in the early years support from either the Justice Department or the administration or the Congress. There was a consensus that the INS needed to grow. The difficulty was that the Congress sometimes wanted the growth in different ways and in different programs than the administration proposed. And in key areas such as technology, the funding really tapered at the time where we needed it to keep expanding, because our workforce had expanded so quickly that we were eating up the money just with the operating the systems that we had, and we were not able to continue the new systems development that we needed in order to support the workforce. Now, I've seen Commissioner Ziegler's testimony, and I wish I had thought of doing an analysis like that. It is entirely possible that INS needs to be a $40 billion agency. I can't say independently anything about that. I think that the most important thing for the growth of an agency like INS is that it be steady and balanced and across the board. Our problem was that the money and the Congress's desire for the money was focused almost entirely on the southwest border, whereas the case that we made and that the Justice Department and the administration supported us on was for an across-the-board distribution of resources. The areas that were not getting the money: technology, interior enforcement, and the borders comprehensively, which is not simply the southwest border, but also our ports of entry and the kinds of data and technology efforts that needed to take place as between us and customs and us and consular affairs, because this has to be a seamlessness. The duties are divided among agencies, but the people and the responsibility for running the immigration system is cross-cutting.
In addition to being orphans, you both have in common the fact that your agencies have a dual and some would say almost incompatible mission. One is enforcement in each case, which is always unpleasant. People don't smile when you enforce. And service, helping travelers, facilitating air travel and so forth, helping citizens in need abroad. And the criticism of both of the cultures of the agencies you headed, and indeed to a certain extent of each of your tenures, has been that enforcement was seriously neglected or de-emphasized, while service and assistance and facilitation was greatly emphasized, and that the money flowed to the soft helping rather than the hard enforcing. And specifically on really putting teeth into the denial of visas and looking at Visa Express, for instance, looking at things like transit without visa, that essentially the Consular Corps kind of thought this was not really their business or much of a threat. That has come through from a good deal of the interviewing we've done. Would you care to comment on that, Ambassador?
Mr. Secretary, I would agree. I would disagree with that statement. I think that we did balance law enforcement and travel facilitation. We poured what money we had into improving our lookout systems with CLASS, with tip-off, with Visas Viper, all of which were designed to get us the information that we needed to identify people that we should keep out of the country. I don't think travel facilitation and law enforcement are opposites. I think they're all part of the whole scheme of things as we were trying to do them. Visa Express, which I agree, I mean, I certainly wish that it had a different name. It's a very unfortunate name because it makes people think that we just issued visas.
Well, the problem is not that you issued visas, it's the fact that some terrorists actually used it from third countries to get visas that, had it not been in place, they would not have presumably been able to get.
No, I don't think that that's really correct, because prior to the time of Visa Express, most of the people in Saudi Arabia were not interviewed. What happened was that they would come, this is pre-Visa Express, they would come in the mornings and they would make their application, they would drop off their passports with the application. They would come back in the afternoon to pick up their passports. Thus, there was the waiting rooms in both Riyadh and Jeddah were insufficient for the numbers of people who were applying for visas, and so there was a great deal of milling around outside of the embassy, both in the morning and the afternoon, which was of great concern to the regional security officers at both posts, because, as you know, in 2001, we were having intelligence information that there were threats against our interests in Saudi Arabia. And in fact, in July of 2001, we put out a travel warning on the Arabian Peninsula because the threats that we were hearing were so great. So I don't think that Visa Express changed anything, except that a third party now received the passports and submitted them to us, and eliminated the crowds at the embassy and at the consulate. The systems, the consular systems staff, which developed CLASS when we had the money through MRV fees, developed it so that you could not print a visa without checking the system. There was no override to that at all. You had to check the system so that a consular officer, no matter how busy or overworked or tired or whatever they were, there was no way that they could issue a visa without checking the name, the lookout system CLASS. So I think that knowing what certainly we did in consular affairs prior to September 11th, 2001, we took every step that we could to enforce the law and to be
I would
polite.
respectfully disagree with you. I don't think the record shows that at all. In some of the interviewing of some of your officials that were doing the actual consular functions in Saudi Arabia at the time, they said in so many words, gosh, if we only knew, if someone had told us that Saudi Arabia was a threat, we thought that they were our friends. And all we were looking for were people who were trying to immigrate. And we weren't looking for terrorists. Well, hello. I mean, did anybody read the newspapers? I mean, there were books. The literature was rife with, books like Among the Believers that cataloged this tremendous proselytizing of hatred and of fundamentalism around the world, sourced in Saudi Arabia with many Saudi Arabian institutions and clerics, the source of it. Yet everybody that we talked to said, oh, well, Saudi Arabia, as they issued visas, Saudi Arabia is our friend, so we don't look for terrorists here, maybe somewhere else, like Pakistan, which is the point I was making with one of the terrorists who applied for a visa thanks to the changes that were made with Visa Express from a third country that he would have gotten much different scrutiny had he not done it into Saudi Arabia. So that is, I don't think the record supports your view.
Before September 11th, and I think even after September 11th till now, I think that this government, our government, does regard Saudi Arabia as an ally. In the current issue of Foreign Affairs, the Deputy Secretary says that we have every confidence in the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia to carry out the reforms that he's trying to carry out. I mean, it doesn't sound like we regard Saudi Arabia as a state sponsor of terrorism. It was never so identified before September 11th. It was never so identified after September 11th.
But did you only have robots that just take what the official State Department characterization is? Don't they read the papers? Don't they know that so much of the funding, so much of the ideological motivation is sourced there? I mean, you know, in fact, after the fact, as you clearly demonstrate and affirm, we were told by consular officers that there was no change. They felt after the attack, oh gosh, we really screwed up. 15 of them we gave visas to 15 of these guys, there are going to be some big reforms coming, and nothing was ever done. Did you call all hands in for an offsite? Did you require after-action reports? Did you do a lessons learned and how we're going to do things differently? There was a reason why 15 of them were on Saudi passports, and that's because the way you were doing business in Saudi, I mean, you can blame it on the official ostrich view of this Department of State, perhaps, but these were people that are supposed to have personal judgment, education, and ability to ask the right questions on their own, regardless of what the Secretary of State happens to be saying.
We were dependent on the intelligence and law enforcement agencies to give us information on people that they believed we should keep out of the country. I don't believe that in a visa interview you would ever uncover a terrorist. We are dependent on the people whose job it is to develop that kind of information. We set up all the consular automated systems that we could designed to get that information. And the system was state-of-the-art, is state-of-the-art. It contains a lot of names. These people were not known to intelligence or to law enforcement. At least 17 of the 19 were not known at all. And even if we interviewed everybody, I do not believe that we would have uncovered the fact that they were terrorists.
I think our staff disagrees with that, but Ms. Meissner, I don't want to let you off the hook here. You, for better or for worse, had a reputation in the during your tenure, and we got this from a number of your subordinates, that there was a clear culture of de-emphasizing enforcement. You deferred, you did not spend the money that was appropriated on the student tracking system, the biometrics for student tracking. There were stop work orders on it. It was never fully implemented. You told us during your interviews that you personally opposed the entry-exit program that was put in and even supported repeal of it. And why this bias in both of our frontline outer defenses against enforcement?
I have to disagree with that characterization. The enforcement responsibilities of the INS have always been its primary responsibilities, and I spent more time and effort on the enforcement portfolio at INS than any other single thing. I did and do believe that in order to enforce the immigration law properly and effectively, it has to be done in a balanced way. In other words, the enforcement of the law simply done along the southwest border by Border Patrol agents is not sufficient. The entire agency's responsibilities have to be done in an integrated and robust fashion. The staff statement today is a good example in talking about foreign student visas and applications for visa changes. If INS's backlogs were up to date the way they should be, you wouldn't have to have the kinds of regulations that allow people to come on a visitor visa and then apply for a student visa, because the application for student visa would be timely and the information would be available and the regulations that create the workarounds wouldn't be required. That kind of work is considered facilitation work, but it has an extremely important impact on our ability to enforce the law properly. Now, where student tracking is concerned and entry-exit are concerned, my difficulties with those programs were not difficulties of the basic concept. Student tracking, in the first place, did not have any funding allocated for it. The way that student tracking was to take place was through a fee which was described in the legislation, which was to be collected from the foreign student by the schools themselves. There was a great deal of objection to that by the schools and by members of Congress. And ultimately that legislative formula was changed so that the fee was collected in a different way. Notwithstanding that there was no budget for foreign student tracking, we took funds, $10 million, as the staff statement describes, from other automation projects in order to design a pilot and test a pilot along the timetable that had been set out in the legislation. So what we did was work on parallel tracks. We moved ahead with the automation planning just as we were advocating and working with the Congress on a legislative change that would make the funding mechanism be a more sensible one and one that all the stakeholders could live with. Similarly on entry-exit. On entry-exit, the timetable that was set up in the legislation was absolutely undoable. They were calling for, in a 1996 law, an entry-exit program to be in place by 1998. That could not happen. As I explained, we have never had departure controls from this country. We went ahead and designed what the front end of a system for entry-exit could be, again, parallel track with the Congress to try to change the timetable in the legislation so that there would be the opportunity to design the kind of a system that could actually work. In fact, on entry-exit, INS itself, very early in my tenure, made a very big effort to publish research that showed that 40% of the people in the United States who were here as in an illegal status were here not because they had come improperly across the southwest border, but because they had overstayed a visa, and that the effort to deal with illegal migration to the United States had to be one that dealt with ports of entry and with overstays just as it dealt with southwest border circumstances. But an entry-exit system is a massive system to put into place, and it continues to be a problem even with the high priority that is now being given to it since September 11th, because we don't have the highway systems, we don't have the setups in our airports to physically handle people checking out when they leave the country. So I think that I don't doubt that people that were in the INS have told you what they did and mistook, were mistaken or misunderstood what it is that I was trying to do. But what it is that I was trying to do was put a balanced system into place so that the parts actually could work effectively on both the facilitation and the enforcement side, because they are mutually supporting. They are not contradictory.
Thank you. I have one final question, and if you could keep your answers brief, we're running a little over time. There was a famous quote when the Berlin Wall fell from an East German worker that said, our system was based on the state pretended to pay us and we pretended to work. It's my belief that what has been revealed in our investigations is that Congress and a succession of administrations pretended to want enforcement of immigration law, and your two agencies pretended to try to enforce it. The gap between the stated purpose of immigration law and the execution is so vast that it makes a farce of the whole concept of rule of law. And so, for instance, today, there's still, before 9/11, there were only 2,000 interior enforcers in the immigration function. As you rightly complain, how can you go check students overstaying their visas with only 2,000 people? Today, there's still only 2,000 people. So enforcement, not everybody really wants illegals put under a rule of law, and that's a huge hypocrisy. So with that preamble, could you, each of you, give us, in 25 words or less, your recommendation on how to fix this lamentable situation?
I would say, Mr. Secretary, there was no pretense on the part of consular officers either in Washington or abroad, on enforcing our immigration laws. It's up to the administration and to the American people to decide what kind of immigration laws they want. I think that this country cries out for immigration reform, but I can assure you that consular officers take their responsibility to enforce the law very, very seriously. They do the best they can with the tools they have, and I think it's an unfair characterization to say that they were pretending to enforce the law.
I would say that as a country, we are ambivalent and always have been ambivalent about what we want out of our immigration system and out of our immigration policy. Immigration is an area that the pendulum has swung widely back and forth over history as between tough enforcement, exclusion, discriminatory policies, and very permissive lax approaches when it serves our interests, and that remains unsettled. That's very different, however, from being in the agency and having a set of specific responsibilities and people whose work you direct on a day-to-day basis. And where that is concerned, I certainly must say that during my tenure, we made every possible effort to rationalize a system and a political ambivalence that continues today.
Thank you very much.